Welcome everyone. This is my fourth blog. Today's topic is the First Amendment, specifically the freedom of speech. However, before I get into that, please do not use anything I'm about to say as legal advice. This series is intended to educate, however, it is not meant to replace or substitute for sound legal counsel. Please, if you find yourself in need of legal advice, go see a lawyer. That said, I promised that I'd have a video about what the First Amendment is, what the First Amendment isn't, and some exceptions to it, and then finally signs of a censorious argument. And I will cover all of these for the glory of YouTube. So, when you come to the First Amendment, the first thing to ask is, or to state, is obviously this is going to be an American perspective. So please, don't hit me that it's not a universal worldwide thing. I know that America is just about the only country that has a proper respect enshrined in law for freedom of speech, and I'll get into highlights of that. If you think your country does respect freedom of speech, feel free to argue with me on that point. And I'll do my research. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I think America's fighting a war, honestly, on the First Amendment too, but that's another story. So, what is the First Amendment? Well, the First Amendment is enshrined as one of the cornerstones behind how this democracy that we have should work. Please, I don't want to get currently into any debates on whether or not it does work, or whether its failings are working as intended, or any of that, those kind of arguments. That's beyond the scope of this blog. But a cornerstone of what is supposed to make this democracy work is the freedom of speech. Specifically, the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States states that the government shall pass no law, followed by 5 clauses, the third of which is abridging freedom of speech. Now, you need to understand that the idea is that if the government were capable of suppressing speech generally, then by legal means, you would end up in a situation where you cannot get a full discourse about any particular subject, because there will always be people that are going to be that can't speak out, and if the government doesn't like a specific set of speech, that gets clamped down. You can see it in the way China has the overarching result of the Tiananmen, I think that's how it's pronounced, Tiananmen Square guy who, bag of groceries standing in front of a tank, It was part of a series of protests that were famous. They happened about 20 years ago. And now, when a Chinese person comes and studies here in America, they can find out about this. It's something you can't hear about in China. You can't find it on the internet. That great firewall of China they talk about. So what happens is then China not being they go back to China and they try to talk about this. And this happened very recently, and there was a letter sent to the American media in response to a student who came to America and learned about the Tiananmen Square massacre and said, well, we should know about this stuff. It's our history. And the response from the Chinese government was that as a culture, they had decided not to talk about it. And obviously, we've got someone here who learned about it for the first time and wanted to talk about it. So it's obviously more than just this isn't a cultural decision. This is the government having made a decision, and because the government made the decision that they weren't going to talk about it, preventing that discussion, and that hampers the free flow of information in China. And that's what we want to prevent here in America. We want the free flow of ideas. Who here was surprised during the last presidential election when independent Gary Johnson announced that he recently had used marijuana as a medical for medical reasons, and thinks our war on marijuana is absolutely ridiculous. Recently, the guy behind the marijuana ban, and when I say that, I mean the doctor who supported the well, not behind the ban, he's behind the current policy. And that is something like 20 years ago, this doctor, I can't remember his name, testified that marijuana was a dangerous drug. And there's a reason it's on the Schedule 1 it's on the banned list. I think that's Schedule 1. And that it had to stay there. Well, within the last 3 years, again, I don't remember exactly when, but a very interesting thing happened. This guy came back around and said, I was wrong. You see, in those intervening 20 years, what happened is this guy, this doctor, started doing research and realized that everything he had been taught about marijuana usage was wrong. Specifically, we had when marijuana, and I'm not talking hemp here, I'm talking marijuana, when the plant, when marijuana was placed on the drug list, the controlled substances list, it was specifically to be put there until further research could be done to determine its actual effect and whether it should remain there. and that research never happened, and it's just stayed restricted. And so this doctor came back and said, I was wrong. Now, in another country with a drug war like we have, that guy wouldn't have been able to come out and say that. That guy wouldn't have been able to do it. It just would have been ridiculous. Freedom of speech allows us to hear these things. Now, what isn't freedom of speech? Freedom of speech is only the protection from the government. Refer to the reference in the law. Freedom of speech is only about the government establishing law that restricts speech. So, that means if you say something, it does not protect you from your employer's reaction. It does not protect you from the internet's reaction. It does not protect you from your friends' reactions. It does not protect you from your spouse's reaction. Now, in some cases, those reactions might be criminal in of themselves and are being and you are protected against them because of things like bans on assault, protection from someone saying that you do bad things for kids because, whatever because you hold stance A, and all people who hold stance A are horrible to kids. Again, I'm trying to keep it family friendly, so if you don't get what I mean, go ahead and message me and ask. So when you're nothing the government does protects you from other people's speech. In fact, it is said that on the internet, a lawsuit is the worst way to deal with speech you don't like. The best answer to speech is more speech. This can be really hard for people who have been targeted by men's rights activists. What I will call militant feminists. Please note, I consider myself a feminist. When I say this, I refer to people who take the concept of feminism beyond equality and toward a matriarchy instead of a patriarchy that they argue we have. They say, let's put all the women in charge instead. And that goes too far. That is what I refer to as a militant feminist. So please, if you are an actual feminist, do not think I am bashing feminism. I believe that there are significant inequalities in the men in gender issues, and those do need to be addressed. So back on topic. It's really hard for people targeted by these groups. And you can listen to just about every group, any group with a big political movement, and you can point to a group of people in them that will target people for their speech and harass them endlessly. Some of that is good. We want the Duggars to be shamed for the way they responded to Josh Please note, I do make a significant distinction between, I'm not going to get into that. I'll cover the Duggars in another video. How about that? But we want, we want people to be shamed for shameful acts. But the side effect of that is, in our society, that people can be shamed for acts that shouldn't be shaming. And that is an unfortunate consequence that we should deal with. And I'm going to get to that we should have to suffer. And I'll get into discussions on that later in this video. So freedom of speech is not a blanket protection. It's only protection from the government and government mandated restitution. Now you're probably staring at me and saying, but defamation. You're right. Defamation is an exception to First Amendment. And basically we've decided as a society that and by as a society I mean through the courts have decided that there are specific narrow exceptions to the concepts of free speech that are very necessary for a stable society. Defamation, libel, slander, they're different names for the same basic concept, which is to say false statements of fact. If you want more information, please see my video on defamation. And the idea is that a false statement of fact is considered an egregious breach of public trust. And it harms the general discourse that the First Amendment is trying to promote. And therefore, the First Amendment right is restricted in this very narrowly tailored instance. There are a list of them. You can probably find them on Wikipedia. In fact, I know you can find them on Wikipedia. The other big one that occurs in our society is the two more exceptions that I'll bring up that are very prominent in our society is obscenity. And this is actually a very controversial one. And that's the idea that things that are considered obscene or not in the public taste can be restricted. That's why we can restrict the sale of certain materials to people who are 18. Certain adult material, what are called so-called adult materials, to people who are 18. That is because they are considered obscene, fall into the obscenity exception. I, for one, support the obscenity exception, but not because it's obscene. I support the obscenity exception because, in general, that industry has shown itself to be unwilling to self-police. Much like alcohol and tobacco industries, when given the chance, will target kids. There are industries that will not self-police, and therefore so, and therefore an outside source should police them. This is still a controversial interpretation, and I recognize that many of you might disagree with that. But I'll give a good example. There has been repeated calls to ban or restrict mature rated video games. And in fact, the entire rating system is based off of what came out of a threat that such restrictions would get put in place by the government. So someone came up with a self-policing mechanism similar to movies called the ESRB. And so the question and what happened with that, and recently the Supreme Court ruled that video games were not covered by obscenity laws, at least in general, and struck down the California law, which would have banned that sale. Now, why do I support the video game industry self-policing and not and you'll notice it's because in general, since the year 2000, significant improvements have been made in adherence to the self-policing policies. Something like 10 years ago, it was horrible. Absolutely horrible. But within the last 5 years, retention rates are somewhere around 90%. Over 90%, I should say. Adherence rates are over 90%. And that is far better than cigarettes or tobacco. Cigarettes and tobacco, same thing. Cigarettes and alcohol. There, I finally got it out on the third try. Cigarettes and alcohol, they get sold to minors far more often than video games. And the system is pretty good. It allows a parent to decide whether or not to purchase that game for their child, whether their child is mature enough to handle it, and puts that burden where it should belong on the parent, and then leaves the rest of the video game, and then and only make sure that the parent says it's okay. That's all the verification that happens in those instances. GameStop's pretty good about it. So is Target and Walmart. They have voluntarily, I mean, sure, with the threat of legal action, but voluntarily created a better system than the existing system for alcohol and tobacco established by the government, and therefore shows that these things don't need to be legislated. But so there's the obscenity exception, and I don't entirely agree with it. To a degree I do, to a degree I don't. But then there's the other one, and this is a big one right now. Supreme Court just punted a decision about this one. I'll get into that more in a second. And that is true threats. I'm sure you've mentioned when someone gets beat up, you've heard the term assault be applied. That is actually technically legal incorrect. Assault is what the true threat doctrine applies, which is to say that you issue a threat to a specific person or group of individuals that is considered to be true and inflicts emotional harm, whether or not it is eventually carried out. Now, the true threat doctrine has a small problem, and that's that in some area there's a bit of a disagreement as to what qualifies as a true threat. I'm sure most people are familiar with rap, and how a lot, when it became big, it was a very gangster-filled medium, and there was a lot of talk of violence, and I'm pretty sure some out-and-out threats against rival gangs and rappers were spouted, and so it's kind of a core thing in rap music, making threats as part of the art. Very key distinction. Those aren't threats being made that are harming. They aren't intentionally necessarily true threats. They could very well just be part of the artistic claim, part of the music, and part of the emotions trying to be expressed in the music, and aren't necessarily an actual threat against the person or persons being threatened. I'm bringing this up because there's a story of a high school kid who was recently threatened with not threatened, he was charged with making a threat. And if you read what he wrote, it was a pretty common rap lyric. And the argument goes that a reasonable person would have construed his statements as a threat, and therefore it is a true threat under the law. Free speech advocates don't like this decision. Free speech advocates say that there needs to be actual malice behind the threat, meaning there needs to be an actual intention to fulfill the threat. This is a far harder barrier to prove, and will likely mean many threats get unpunished. But that is the idea. We are a society that believes that everyone should be free to speak within civil discourse, and as much as we hate that speech, even though we hate speech, true freedom of speech advocates advocate for speech they don't like. Now, I mentioned the Supreme Court punted on this case. Supreme Court was recently given a chance to decide to rule on whether or not this was a true threat. And I apologize, I can't remember what they decided, but I know specifically that because of what they decided, that after making this long ruling detailing that specific errors made in the case, and that the case should be re-examined to account for these factors, they decided that at this time they don't need to decide on the true threat issue, and that is absolutely ridiculous. People everywhere were hoping that this case would finally settle what constitutes a true threat. Can the reasonable person standard be used, or does it require an actual malice standard? And the Supreme Court completely punted on the First Amendment issue and left it in the lower court's hands again. I'm anticipating that 2-3 years from now, this case will be once again heard before the Supreme Court. Because I don't think it's going to change the ruling in this case. But even if it does, we're going to hear a similar case before the court, because this is happening all over. Police are arresting people for offhanded comments made on Facebook. Please note that a lot of what gets posted in a Facebook status feed is basically someone who is chatting amongst friends. That's not really what it is, but that's the way people treat it. And so, you know, you for instance, you had a lot of people who talked about what they'd do if they caught Osama bin Laden. Did you honestly think that any single one of them, except maybe the government, actually intended to go hunt down Obama and not Obama. Wow, my head's... Sorry, it's really hot out here. This is killer. But Osama bin Laden, did you think anyone would have actually hunted Osama and hunted down Osama and committed those acts? No. They were going to sit on their ass. They were shooting the shit with friends. It's a very critical distinction. There was no... that was not a true threat. That is the core of the decision that needs to be made, and honestly, I hope it finally gets made right. This court's been making a lot of good constitutional decisions, but it's made a few bad ones. So we'll have to see. Now, having covered those exceptions, I know I'm clocking in long. I'm sorry, people. But this is a big topic. The final argument you need to consider, the final thing we need to consider is censorious actions. How can you tell if someone is trying to rationally argue for a limitation on free speech, or someone who's trying to censor speech they don't like? And I will tell you a few examples. I'm also going to post a link down below to the in the description to a blog by Ken White at Popat. One of the legal blogs I read, I may have mentioned it before, and Popat, he's recently detailed a long list of tropes that you see in the media when someone is attempting to censor speech they don't like. Some key examples. The classic example. If you ever hear anyone say this argument, you immediately know they do not understand what they're talking about. You can't say fire in a crowded theater. All right, so it is true that in a Supreme Court decision, I think last century, I think sometime in the 1900s, but it might have even been in the 1800s, someone made a decision. No, it had to have been mid-1900s. a Supreme Court justice in writing a decision for the Supreme Court did in fact say you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. But that was not all he said. It was actually, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater where there is no fire, and there are a couple restrictions on it. But people cut out that one snippet. What people who like to quote this don't tell you is that this standard then spent the next 30 years getting cut back, so that cutting it back, it was too broad. The Supreme Court realized it was too broad, and in a case after case, weakened that standard. These courts included the justice that originally wrote that opinion, and he agreed with all of them and wishes he hadn't written that phrase on a page. Look it up. In fact, you can find lists of numerous times where it is completely legal to yell fire in a crowded theater. For instance, you can yell fire in a crowded theater when there is an actual fire. You can yell fire in a crowded theater when there is a danger to the life of people in that, of life and limb to people in that theater, and it would take too long to explain it. Fire will get them out of the theater far quicker. You can be on stage and make the grand proclamation of fire as part of your performance. That soundbite sounds really good, but someone actually came up with a list of more than like 50 places scenarios where yelling fire in a crowded theater is perfectly acceptable, even if it causes a panic, and even if it causes harm to life and limb, if that panic causes harm to life or limb. In general, it actually is okay to say fire in a crowded theater. It is not okay to intentionally attempt to incite a panic in a crowded theater. I should even clarify that further. It is illegal to incite a panic in a crowded theater without need, and even then you'll only be harmed if there is injury to life or limb. So as you can see, the standard is a lot broader than or a lot more narrow than that statement would have you believe. But people who want to censor speech love to use it because it's a broad example of speech that's restricted, and it's flat out wrong. Gotta try to wrap this up. All right. So what's another good example? There's a hate speech. I'll just start with hate speech. There is no such thing as hate speech in America. And all of you are going, oh, but this, oh, but that, oh, but the Westboro Baptist Church. Yes, these are despicable, horrible, wrong people. And shouldn't, they aren't worth the time for me to really talk about. They're so meaningless. They're just so pitiless people. But the problem is that there is no category of speech that is restricted from the First Amendment that could be categorized as hate speech. It doesn't exist. Calling something hate speech tells me that you do not know the law you are trying to use against whoever you're trying to use it against. You don't understand free speech. Hate speech is the classic example of speech that, while repugnant, is fully protected under the United States Constitution. This is what I talked about when I said that there are some speech we need to accept to have proper speech. The problem is any way you can define hate speech, there's no way to clearly define hate speech that does not harm free speech in general. It just really can't be done. You can't narrowly tailor a hate speech exemption. And that's the problem. Either we're protecting certain people above others with a narrowly tailored exception, or we tailor it broadly to cover any possible hate speech, and then it's a very broad exception to the First Amendment, and we don't want that. Yes, it is horrible, absolutely horrible to be on the receiving end of what people classify as hate speech. I have myself not very significant hate speech, I admit, but I've been on the receiving end of people who hate me for whatever reason, and hate for what I stand for, and have harassed me about it. And unfortunately, we have to let that go. Again, if you want more information, go to the Pope Hat blog. And then the third one I'm going to cover. There's a line between free speech and X. X being generally a social value. Generally, this is a sign of someone who doesn't understand the limitations and exceptions to free speech, because it doesn't actually say anything about why that speech should be banned. For instance, say I really hated rutabagas. There is a line between a vegetable and a rutabaga. Okay, you're right, there is probably a line between the general concept of a vegetable and the specific vegetable rutabaga. But that doesn't tell me why a rutabaga should be accepted from the classification of vegetable, or why having the rutabaga there is a good thing in general, is a bad thing in general. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't actually say anything. It's a filler statement designed to make someone angry and get someone behind you without actually making an argument. And so that's the problem with that. And I'm going to make one last one. What was it? It's in the similar vein. There are limitations on free speech. Yeah. And this is, I mean, if you can't see it, read the Pope Hat blog. But really, you're saying limitations on free speech exist. And what limitation does this fall under? Well, they're not going to tell you. Again, it's designed to get you behind the person, make you think they're making an argument without actually making a big argument. Alright. So, in conclusion, I really hope you guys have learned something about free speech, understanding what it really is, that it's a very broad concept compared with the limitations, which are very narrowly tailored to cover specific things that are harming society. And yeah, we do not want. I am a free speech supporter. I believe it is critical to any future, this democracy. If we're going to even be able to say that we're a democracy 20 years from now, it is critical that all of the restrictions the government is attempting to put on the concept of speech be fought against, that we recognize that free speech, speech in general, should be considered free speech, and that you have to work on the assumption that it's free until someone else shows you an exception in law, that someone can show you a rational, purposeful mean to classify something that is very narrowly tailored and does its best to avoid impacting free speech, the share of ideas, freedom of expression. That's actually what freedom of speech should really be called, freedom of expression, given that free speech is a very broadly tailored concept. I wish I'd covered that earlier. So I'm going to cover that right now. Free speech is a very broadly interpreted concept. Symbolic speech is considered speech. Actions like spending money, again, I'll kind of cover that in another video. It's a whole hornet's nest. But, you know, spending money, burning a flag, stepping on a flag, art is a form of speech. Symbolic acts of speech and actions, as they say, actions speak louder than words, so your actions are in general considered a form of speech, and so you need to and the courts have been ruling that, and that's a really good thing, and we need to make sure that never ever accept a restriction on the freedom of speech without a very, very solid reason. I'll be back next week, probably with more blogs. Please comment on any legal concepts you want answered. Upcoming topics include renters' rights. So please go ahead and comment, share. Thank you for watching.